I really didn't have an external idea of success. I wasn't like an ambitious child, or I don't think I've ever been ambitious or that I've even longed for. To me, success is only about values. It's only about holding up the what is wholesome, what is loving, what is just, and healing the places of brokenness. That's the only thing I can think of as any success that I would want to participate in.
Welcome to Making Change with Your Money, a podcast that highlights the stories and strategies of women who experienced a big life transition and overcame challenges as they redefined financial success for themselves. Now here's your host, certified financial planner, Laura Rotter.
I am so excited to have as my guest today, my teacher, Rabbi Sheila Peltz Weinberg. Rabbi Weinberg served as a congregational rabbi for 17 years, and I know her as a teacher of mindfulness meditation to rabbis, Jewish professionals, and lay people with the Institute of Jewish Spirituality. She's published widely on topics such as feminism, spiritual direction, parenting, social justice, and mindfulness from a Jewish perspective. And she's married to Maynard Cedar, and they have 3 married children and 6 grandchildren. So welcome, Sheila, to the Making Change with Your Money podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So I always start all my interviews off with the same question, Sheila, and that is, what was money like in your family growing up?
Well, my parents were storekeepers. My parents were storekeepers in New York. Actually, my father had hoped to be a doctor, but he ended up becoming, and he trained as a pharmacist, but he ended up going into my grandfather's business, which was floor covering, retail floor covering in New York, and it focused in the Bronx. And my mother was in the business and my father was in the business. The business was the center of their lives. The center of their lives. And money was very, very important, especially to my mother, who was really the leader. She loved the business. My father, I think, was tremendously disappointed. He would have much rather been a doctor. His friends were doctors. It was a struggle for him, although he did it for the money, I suppose. I mean, no, they did it. And my mother was generous in her support of certain causes, like Hadassah.
I'm a Hadassah member.
I'm a lifelong Hadassah member. But they were, she was very, very, very cautious about spending money. Very cautious. My father, much less so. He bought the latest thing that came up. If it was a color TV, a thing that came out, he got it. And she was like, really? So it loomed large, shall we say. Well, I had one sister. My parents had 2 children, my sister, and then they had a son. My sister was 16 years older than me. So she was born in 1930. And my brother was born after that, and he was killed when he was 6 in a accident on the street of my mother's store, actually. He was 6 years old. My sister was 14. And I was born 9 months, a year and a half later, as my cousin doesn't like me to refer this way, but I was a replacement child. They weren't going to have children. They were old in those days, considered old for children, but I was born. And my sister passed away about a couple of years ago. So I grew up mostly as an only child. My sister married when she was 18, and I was home basically as an only child.
Wow, thank you for sharing that family dynamic. So a lot of expectations that maybe you weren't aware of on your shoulders when you were born. And what expectations, Sheila, if any, were there around education as you?
So I grew up, I was born in 1946. So I went to the local public school. There wasn't any question. At one point, my father was close to a rabbi, and they thought maybe they should send me to a Jewish day school, Ramaz. But they did. My mother thought it would be too Jewish. She didn't want me to be that Jewish. It was enough, but not that Jewish. So I went to public school. I did well. I went to junior high. I was in what they call the SPs. That was special progress. We skipped 8th grade. And then it came time for high school. And I had a good enough marks, whatever, to go to one of the specialized high schools that you had to have a test for, you had to have a right IQ for, or something like that. But I had no capacities for music and art, so that was out. They couldn't even consider me going to performing arts, although that would have been a good place for me probably, but that I sure. Hunter College was all girls. I didn't want to go to an all-girls school. So the only one that was left was the Bronx High School of Science. And I had very little interest in science, actually, but I went to the Bronx High School of Science. And then, as far as a profession or studying for something, at that time, there were really 3 things girls could do. Secretary. I was beyond secretary because I was going to go to college. My sister had gone to college. I could be a teacher or I could be a nurse. And I could not see myself being a nurse because I wasn't that interested in that kind of work. So it was a teacher. That was it. I could be a teacher. That was the only possibility.
It's true. It really was very rare for anyone to do anything other than that. My mother was a teacher. My mother-in-law, while she worked, was a teacher. So I take it you became a teacher?
I could have worked in the store, I suppose. They didn't really want me to work in the store. They didn't want me to work in the store that much, although I did, sort of off times. So, yeah, I did become a teacher. At one point, it actually occurred to me quite a bit later that I could actually get a PhD and teach in college. I thought of that, and I was actually enrolled in a program in Israel because we had made Aliyah. We had emigrated to Israel in a program at Hebrew University, and I thought I would become a professor of Jewish studies and live in Israel. That was really my ambition. That didn't work out.
Wait, let me stop you there because I don't know this. So who emigrated to Israel? Your whole family? No,
not my whole family. I had been in Israel several times. I was there after I graduated high school. I was only 16. I went for a year. I went in 67. I was married in 66. So that I was under 20 years old. I was married. And we volunteered to go in the summer of 67 at the end of the 6-Day War. And then in 72, I already had a child. I was married to the same man, Steve Weinberg. And we made Aliyah, immigrated to Israel in 72. We went through the whole 9 yards. My ambition was to, as I say, become a professor in Israel. And I was part of a program. And we were there for a little through the 73 war and various circumstances. My parents were sick. My husband wanted to leave. I really didn't want to. I was pregnant. I had a young child. It was going to break up the marriage, or if I stayed, or leave and stay with the marriage and the pregnancy and the little child. So I stayed, and the marriage lasted another 2 years.
I'm still curious to back up, Sheila, right? You grew up, obviously, a Jewish family, but you mentioned how your mother didn't want you to be too Jewish. Where did the Zionism and the strong connection come from?
It came from the times that I was living. My parents made the casual choice, again, through this rabbi who wanted me to go to Ramaz, to send me to Camp Ramah. And it really hooked me big time. The Hebrew, the whole spirituality, Judaism, prayer, even though I wasn't, as a girl, I wasn't allowed to lead prayer. But at that time, I didn't even know that that was an exclusion. I was allowed to study with the boys. And I became absolutely passionate about Jewish studies. And it was all tied up for me with Israel because it was the redemption. It was like I was born to redeem my brother. Israel was born to redeem the Holocaust. That's how we understood it in those days, my age, my time. That was it. It was absolute redemption. And I loved Hebrew. I loved Jewish studies. And I found a program. I was very active in Jewish youth groups. My mother was like, do your English homework, do your science homework, stop with the Jewish homework, stop with all that stuff. I went to the JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, as a teenager to their program. I went through all the Ramah stages. And even though it was really unusual in 62 for a kid to want to go for a year to Israel, I don't know how they let me go, but they did. I was only 16.
I mean, studies have shown that it's Jewish camps, even more than day school, that really tug at your heartstrings and get people emotionally connected. Oh, so thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that background.
Yeah. So it's very deep in me. My son ended up making Aliyah as well when he grew up. The one I was pregnant with him in Israel, and he was born in the States. I called him Ezra, thinking about Ezra returned the exiles back to the homeland, to that level. And he ended up making Aliyah, but he didn't stay. He was there for quite a few years. He was involved in a lot of Israel-Palestinian work and interfaith work and conflict transformation work.
So back to your story. So you, when you were in Israel, thought about becoming a professor to teach Jewish studies. Were you teaching already?
I was teaching. I taught prior to that. I taught in a day school, actually, before we made Aliyah. I taught in a day school. I also was in the Peace Corps for 2 years prior to that. And we did that it was out of I was married at the time, and it was part of out of idealism, but it was also a draft deferment for my husband in those days. We were in Chile. I taught there, and I taught back. We lived in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I taught in a day school, and I didn't really love teaching kids that much. That's why I was more like, I thought I would do better with an academic teaching. And I got the idea that I could do that. But then when I came back from Israel, I was so devastated that I went to work for the Jewish Community Relations Council to do basically Israel community relations. And somewhere along the line, I guess around 1974, 75, well, we came back in 74, 75, 76, I heard that women were being ordained. And I was absolutely blown away. And I was like, oh my God, that is what I was supposed to do.
What did you imagine a rabbi did at that time that?
I had no idea. I had no rabbi models. I had one friend who was a student at Reconstructionist Rabbinical College that I knew. He was a friend of my husband's, but he was a friend of mine. He was in one of the early classes. And I was doing a lot of reading of Mordechai Kaplan. I was reading Martin Buber. I was reading Heschel. I was doing a lot of my own reading, but I had no real Jewish community. Even though I was a member of the synagogue, it wasn't inspiring, and the rabbis there weren't interesting to me. But it wasn't a question of thinking about what I would do as a rabbi. It was purely, that's who I am. That's what I meant to be. However, I am a mother of 2 kids. I'm like in my late 20s. I mean, it's like over. How could I possibly do it?
And at that point, were you a single mom? You were a single mom at that.
Well, it was right around the time that the marriage ended. And then I decided, right before that, I decided I was going to actually apply to rabbinical school. What the hell? I went to see the 2 schools that took women at that time, Hebrew Union College and Reconstructionist. My friend who was at the Reconstructionist College, because I really identified with Mordechai Kaplan. I really liked Reconstructionism. And I read Kaplan stuff and Buber. So he said to me, Sheila, you could be a rabbi. And guess what? We have 2 women in our class, and the smartest person in our class is one of the women by far. And I was like, really? Oh my God. And I went to their graduation. It was in 76. I went to their graduation, and Harold Schulweis, who was a very well-known rabbi in California at the time and a Reconstructionist, gave the graduation address. And after I was still married then. At the end of his talk, or the end of the whatever ceremony was, I ran up to Schulweis like a crazy person. And I said, Rabbi Shlomo, that was such a wonderful talk. I'm going to be a rabbi. I'm going to be a rabbi. He looked at me like, oh, that's nice. Like, who's this wackadoodle person?
So it sounds like it was just an inner knowing, like it wasn't at all a pros and cons. It was just knowing that this was the right role for you. How big was the class, by the way, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College? How many?
When I went there, I mean, I didn't go right away. It took me a bunch of years till I didn't go immediately. I had the idea to go, and then the divorce, and I realized I really wasn't going to be able to go. Then I was a single parent, and then I moved to Philadelphia, though, and I started working for Hillel. So I worked for Hillel. I got a job. I had to work. So I got a job for Hillel, which I did for 5 years in Philadelphia, full time. And, I was with the kids until they got a little older, and was debating all those 5 years, met people who were at the college, was involved with Jewish feminism at that time, the Chavurah movement, had some very important influences. Zalman Schachter Shalomi I met, Art Green, Judith Plasko. I would sort of put those very, very important people for me. Arthur Waskow, we were involved in politics and Jewish politics. That was a very heady time. And in the end, I decided I would do it. I would just do it. My mother was really opposed to it. She was like, Sheila, you'll never find a husband if you become a rabbi. She thought it was a ridiculous idea. She wasn't in favor of my divorce either.
And so, Sheila, why did you do it? Was it, again, this intuitive voice? Because everything you described, you were already immersed in the culture, and it sounds like making a change or involved in the conversations from everything you've just mentioned. So why the actual need to study? What was that about?
Well, part of it was, it's interesting because my boss that time at Hillel, Sheila, you should go get a MSW. So part of it was a feminist thing. Part of it was, I remember saying to myself, if there are going to be women rabbis now for the first time in history, damn it, I'm going to be one. Just like that. Part of it was actually financial. I had 2 kids. I wasn't getting a lot of support from their father. We had a lot of tension at the beginning. We're now very friendly, but in those days it was tense. And I didn't know how the hell I was going to get them through college and this and that. And I knew rabbis, at least male rabbis. I didn't realize the goal, male and women and female rabbis. But in any case, I thought it'd be a good investment. And I was paid very little at Hillel with what I was doing. I was doing a lot and not paid very much. So there was that element. But it took me a long time. And there was a period of time in those years where because I didn't start until 82. So if I first thought about it in 76, I didn't get there till 82. But I did have friends who encouraged me, who were already like the smartest woman in that class, became a very good friend of mine. And she was supportive. And I don't know. When it came right down to it, I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to do it for 1 year. I couldn't imagine doing it for more than 1 year. I'm going to do it for 1 year, and let's see if I can just, what happens after that. And I was in a situation in Hillel where I could hire myself for a part-time job that actually paid fairly decently. And my mother helped out a little bit.
Like, did you actually enjoy the studies?
No, not that much. It was very, very, very difficult. There was very little spirituality. I remember I came with a lot of spiritual searching and connection and longing. And at that time, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College was all about this. Now, luckily, I had a good background because I had lived in Israel. I had done a lot of stuff. My Hebrew was good. I didn't need as much, from them. But the teachers were almost all men. I had one really wonderful woman teacher, and I had Art Green as a teacher, which was very significant. One course, the first course he ever taught, which was very significant. And I had a few teachers that were good. Sid Schwartz was a wonderful teacher. He was you probably know him, Sid Schwartz. He's done a lot of work in the Jewish world. Reconstructionist. But I also had teachers that were very tight, and it did not feel like a supportive environment for me. I had other and I was working, and I had the kids, and I was trying to date, and I had all my women's groups and stuff that I was doing in my politics. So I had a lot going on. So it wasn't like the school was like that, one of my teachers wrote it. I'll never forget this because he wrote this comment on my grades. He said, Sheila's not living up to her potential. I said, that doesn't, he should know what my life was like. I spent 1 year, they let me get out in 4 years instead of 5 or 6 because my Hebrew was, but 1 year I took my kids to Israel for the year. And that was a great year. We rented our place. My father was very supportive. My father, interestingly enough, who never liked my ex-husband, was very supportive of my divorce. And my father actually bought me a house, a small row house in Philadelphia, which made my life possible, really. And then he died. My mother did not approve of any of this. And then my father died. So I was divorced. My father supported me, and he died. So he supported the divorce and the single parenting, and even the rabbi thing he thought was okay, but he was very withdrawn. He wasn't emotive, or he was probably very depressed, as it turns out. In any case, I don't know. The year
was that while you were in rabbinical school? He passed away while you were in rabbinical school?
No, this was way before. This was right after my divorce.
Oh,
yeah. It was right after my divorce when I first moved to Philadelphia, and after I moved there. But having the house was an enormous support to me. Life, huge, incredible. I mean, I had to, take care of it and all of that, but still, it was amazing. And I sent my kids to day school, and we got scholarships and loans and blah, blah, blah. But I wanted them both to go to day school, and they did. And then we went to Israel for a year. That was 84, 85. And we rented a place. And that was an amazing, amazing, incredible year. And I had fantastic teachers. I had some fantastic superstar teachers. Moshe Greenberg. I had Nechama Leibovitz, Yehuda Amichai.
Oh, my God. For those of you listening who don't know, these are big, well-known names in Jewish academic study world. Wow. And so that was one of the 4 years of rabbinical school. And were you working while you were?
Not in Israel. I didn't work in Israel. And then when I came back from Israel, I did my 4th and 5th year together. And then I got a pulpit. That was amazing. I actually had a real pulpit. The rabbi had left, and it was a kind of a mess. And they hired me half-time, although I was their only rabbi. And it was a conservative synagogue. So I was doing 4th year and 5th year rabbinical school, and I had this pulpit. So I used to do whatever it was I learned in school. I used to give those as sermons. And I remember one of the congregants saying to me, Sheila, your sermons, they don't really have much to do with anything. They're so abstract. Yeah, I don't have time to do my work for school and then make up another sermon for you guys. But they hired me after that anyway as their rabbi, and I was there for another 3 years.
Sheila, was that a risk for them at that time to hire? I mean, it sounds...
They were desperate. Yeah, they were desperate. It was, the summer, and they didn't have anybody. They had to have somebody. So
in your description of the rabbinical school, and I also have been a member of a Reconstructionist synagogue for, God, it's a long time. I joined 1989. And there too, there was a big shift from what was a very intellectual. Everything was from the head, and the clergy that's responsible for me joining really over this long period of time shifted it to be more spiritual. And so if you could talk about your journey, because I know you post your role as a pulpit rabbi, how did that come about?
Okay. Well, I started with the spirituality, and then it was kind of sucked out of me in rabbinical school to some degree. Although, I've written about this. One of the things I did to sort of cope with my life, which was quite challenging was I drank. I drank. And I mean, I didn't do drugs except for pot, but I did do alcohol and, sort of kept me together for a while until it stopped working. And I realized this was really a problem. This was not a good thing. Even though my friends were all like, oh, Sheila, it's not really a problem. I mean, you're so, high functioning. And even the guys I dated didn't really see it, but I knew. And then I got to a point when I started after my first full year in rabbinical school at pulpit. And I had a few accidents. I fell a couple of times, and I would go to the bar mitzvah at the synagogue, and the bartender would say, "What'll it be, Rabbi?" And I would always get the expensive stuff at the bar mitzvahs because I could drink cheap wine at home. And my daughter was getting a little suspicious of me, especially in the pot smoking, because she was like 16. And I was trying to hide that from her, but she knew, and the kids were getting all these things. I mean, my son was 12, my daughter was 16. She was getting all these, lessons in school about drugs and alcohol. And one thing after another. In any case, I reached a point where I knew that I had a friend, it was another rabbi actually, who decided to stop smoking pot. And she gave me all her papers. But I also knew that she had gotten help. And there was a moment when I told her that I needed help, and she understood and sent me to a women in recovery place. And I met this amazing woman who became my sponsor, Grace, Black woman, Christian at the time, and she became a Muslim. And she was an amazing spirit. And I started going to AA meetings. I stopped drinking and started going to AA meetings. And I was a rabbi at the synagogue at this point. And I found in a renewed, I mean, it was there for me, but a completely renewed sense of spiritual life on a profound level. But don't forget, I had also hung out with Zalman and Art. Lynn Gottlieb was a friend of mine back in the early days, but Zalman's scene was pretty druggy, in the early days. So I really had to withdraw from a lot of that world. I had to withdraw from a fair amount of worlds that were sort of spiritual in that way, but not sober. Because my dedication was to a sober spirituality. And so that lasted, through that period of time. And then I had this very profound emotional experience where I reconnected to a man that was in love with me when we were in high school. And he was an amazing guy, and we fell in love again. And then he was diagnosed with cancer, and I kind of was with him through his illness and death. And his death was devastating, but I stayed sober. But I realized at that time I needed to do something else. My daughter was going to college, and my son was very unhappy at the day school in Philadelphia. And my friends from my women's circles told me there was an opening in Amherst, Massachusetts for a rabbi. And that synagogue had never had a full-time rabbi. See, the synagogue I was in was an established conservative synagogue, and I wasn't really a fit. I didn't buy into their no intermarriage, and I didn't buy into a lot of their things. But, I was able to do it because I had a conservative background. And, I cared about the people, and I did the rabbi thing. But to be the first rabbi and go as myself to the new pulpit in Massachusetts. So I went up there and they hired me, Amherst, Massachusetts. And we moved up there. And Amherst, Massachusetts, I mean, I've told this story, but the head of the search committee was a man named Ted Slovin, beloved, dear man. He was also on the board of Insight Meditation Society, which was the Buddhist center that was only less than an hour away. And it was also an hour from Kripalu, the yoga center. Now, I was already into yoga to some degree, and I had been to Kripalu. He said, this synagogue, the Jewish community of Amherst, is midway between two of the premier spiritual centers, Kripalu and Insight Meditation, Rabbi. Now, if you say it's to a normal rabbi, they're going to say, what? But to me, right. And Amherst is a very, very crunchy place, very progressive, very crunchy. And I could be myself pretty much. I could be myself. I mean, it was a startup in a lot of ways. And then shortly after that, the next year or two, I became very close to our sister, Paula Green, who had a strong Buddhist connection, interestingly enough. And I ended up going to my first 10-day retreat in Insight Meditation Society. And I realized, oh my God, I could do this in Jewish. And then I met Sylvia, because most of the Jews there were not interested in Jewish, except for Sylvia Borstein.
I mean, as I listen to you, Sheila, one could say that, right, these karmic things or these bashar things happen to you, and it's really because you've listened to yourself and what you're drawn to, even with all the responsibilities that you had. It's not like you could just pick up and go wherever you wanted. You had children, and yet by being true to yourself, you put yourself in a position to be in the right place at the right time or meet the right people. Is that how you experienced it?
I think so. I think I feel I've been guided every step of the way. And sometimes I listened more quickly to the guidance and sometimes, I didn't. Coming to Amherst was amazing. After, when I was in AA in Amherst, and in AA in Amherst, I met a guy who was a Catholic, Italian Catholic. And after a couple of years, I said, I'd really like to meet somebody. And my mother was right. Nobody wanted to date a rabbi. And I said, it needs to be a Jewish guy, that's willing to date a rabbi. And this guy said, I think I know somebody. I said, yeah, what's the matter with him? Nothing. He's actually a lovely guy. So this guy fixed me up with Maynard.
And Maynard who's an amazing. Amherst? Maynard
lived in North Adams, which was about an hour and 20 minutes away. But, he was willing to come. We met back and forth, and he was so different from anybody I'd ever known. And he's Jewish, definitely Jewish. His mother was born in Lithuania, but he had not been to shul in 30 years. He started coming to shul Friday nights. He said, I'll come just to see you because I really enjoy watching you. And he was completely and totally supportive of me being a rabbi and doing my thing. And he had really, really good values, but I still was confused. So I had introduced him to some of my friends, my women friends, particularly my lesbian women friends who weren't too crazy about men to start with. I said, what do you think of this guy? He said, this guy's okay. This guy's really okay. So it took me a while. And my son was like, are you sure he's Jewish? And my son.
You don't come across that many Maynards.
No. And he has an 11-year-old son too. So, and my son was at that time 16 and my daughter was 21. She was already almost graduating college.
So how did you make the decision to transition from being a pulpit rabbi?
That was very, very, very hard. That was very hard. I used to feel, I did a lot of retreats for myself. All my time off, I went to IMS, I went to Spirit Rock, I went to England for a period of time to a retreat there. I was very serious. I did their training programs, Spirit Rock's training, because there was no Jewish meditation. You had to learn it from the Buddhists. But all the time I was translating. We started a group in the synagogue, a meditation minyan in the morning at the synagogue. Although people resisted that. We didn't even have a morning minyan, a regular morning minyan. You're going to start a morning meditation minyan? So I said, start a regular minyan. Go ahead. So then we got 2 minyans in the shul. So that was okay. I did a lot of really wild things. And all right, when my son graduated college, I thought to myself, I am a free person. I did my thing with my kids. That was a big moment for me. He was like 23 when he graduated college or something like that. He wasn't and I was doing the retreats. I was doing the retreats at Elad Chaim with Sylvia and then Jeff Roth. And we started the Institute. I started going to meetings. Our first meeting was in 96 and our first program was in 2000. But we were doing programs. I was already teaching and I knew that was very fulfilling work. And I knew that I was doing it. There wasn't like a lot of people doing this. And the synagogue started feeling more and more like a burden. less and less like it was my calling. And I remember being, I think it was being at the first institute cohort of the rabbis, first rabbis. And I was an assistant teacher. Sylvia was the mindfulness teacher. I was an assistant teacher. Art was there, Jonathan Omerman. Sheffa Gold was also an assistant, and Michael Strassfeld was an assistant. So I was in a good company as adjuncts, whatever they called us. And I remember seeing these younger rabbis, and at one point they were talking, and they really wanted to do pulpit work. They had like a lot of energy for it. And I was like, there were a lot of other people that would love to do this job. That was one thing. The other thing was, I guess I must have shared with some of the teachers where I was at, and Sheffa, who's inimitable, speaks her truth. She said, Sheila, if you're meant to do something and you don't do it, it festers. It can be very dangerous.
Oh, you remember that?
Scared me to pieces. And I was married. And as my husband says, I had healthcare. And I got to a point where I said to myself, there is a financial piece to this. I said, I know I'm not going to be homeless. And I know I'm not going to be hungry. I didn't have a job at IJS. All they had to offer me were like gigs, paid me for the gigs. It was not a job. And I had to give up, a nice, secure, it wasn't what the male rabbis after me got by any stretch of the imagination. Thank you very much. Much less. But nonetheless, it was, for me, a nice salary. And between my husband, who was supportive, and I was miserable. I was like Nancy. I used to talk to Nancy about it, and she was Nancy and Rachel. And finally, I just decided I don't know what tipped me over. I just knew I was going to let go and let God.
Oh, I love the way you say that. It's a tough life, the life of a pulpit rabbi.
I did it for 17 years. I am not really a tremendously extroverted person. I may seem that way, but I don't. It was always like a push to be that extroverted. Teaching meditation was much more in alignment with my.
So interesting you say that way. First of all, was it true the first time you did a silent meditation retreat was the 10-day retreat, or you had done shorter? Because, I was privileged to be involved with one you recently led that was, really less than 4 days, which it's like when you go on vacation, by the time you're settling in, you're getting ready to leave. But everybody says to me, oh my God, how are you silent for that long? And it's like, I love being silent. Besides the fact that it's not particularly silent, there's a lot of noises going on.
Yes. And people said to us, you're going to bring silence to the Jews? They'll never sit still. They'll never be quiet. What are you talking about? You're crazy. Said that. And they also said, this is treif. It's Buddhism. You're bringing Buddhism. It's a goyish. It's treif. So we had to listen to both of that. But our first retreat that we did with rabbis at El Chaim, or no, it wasn't El Chaim. It was actually the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. The very first retreat, we just invited our friends. Nobody else would come. But we had some good friends. We had some good friends, and Rachel, oh my God, Rachel Cowan. I miss her so desperately. She was such an angel and such a wise, loving human. And she was so supportive to me and to Nancy. And Nancy, oh my God, such a gift. She's still my really closest, beloved friend. And such a wise, wise woman. So I was very fortunate. And Sylvia, and I had those three women in my life, Rachel, Nancy, and Sylvia. And my feeling was, whatever they tell me to do, I'm willing to do it. They're channeling something, So they were my guides.
So again, you listened to your inner voice and made a transition. I'm wondering now, Sheila, because I know you've described, you're politically involved. Where are you being called to now with everything that's going on in our world? Or are you just sitting with it?
No, I'm not totally sitting with it. What I do that was possibly the last retreat I plan to lead. I'm really not called to be leading retreats at this stage of my life. I did 2 this summer. It was a lot. I do a lot of spiritual one-on-one work. So I do a lot of support around rabbis in the field and rabbinical students. I also work with faculty in the rabbinical school. So that's one thing that I do that feels important. It feels I have the energy and capacity to do it, and people need support now more than ever. I even volunteered to support a new rabbi, through the Reconstructionists. And somebody called me, he's married to a student rabbi in Israel with HUC, things like that. In 2014, I was in Israel with the Reconstructionists. In fact, Les was on that trip. And though I don't think he did the encounter trip, we did the encounter trip where the war was going on. It was the Gaza war. We were in shelters and everything else. Les was there. And I think with their son, their middle son. And anyway, I was overwhelmed when I met the Palestinians at that point with their pain and their anger and their hurt. I had never really confronted that closely. And then in 2018, as I mentioned, Paula Green was involved with a group called Combatants for Peace. And Rachel also was. She knew, and we knew the guy who, Steve Apcon, if you know him, he's up in your neighborhood. He was involved in making that film, Disturbing the Peace. So Maynard agreed he didn't want to go in 2014, Maynard, but in 2018, he went with me on the Combatants for Peace trip. And we spent a lot of time meeting Palestinians and Israelis too. It was a dual narrative trip. It was a very powerful trip. We came back and we started to teach and show slides and show people about the combatants. And we started a group. And we brought 2 of the combatants, an Israeli and a Palestinian. These are former Israeli soldiers, former Palestinian fighters who work together, and they work to end the occupation. I mean, I've known that the occupation is unjust and unsustainable for, forever. I've known that. But the combatants are working together. I was just tremendously moved by them. So then we had the COVID business, but we continued to meet. We went to the joint memorial that they've done with the bereaved parents. And then we organized our own trip, which was a year ago, right before the elections. And it was mostly Philly people. Several of the people that were on that retreat with us went. And it was amazing. And then we came back and then the year of Netanyahu. So we're still meeting. We had a meeting last night. We had hoped to bring combatants to Philly. We want to support them. It feels like it's a small group, but it represents the depths of my heart. So Maynard and I together add that. And then we have a powerful meditation group that I'm part of every Tuesday. And that's a place for people to heal and rest and feel safe. It's not political. But those, I write, I send sign things that I feel are appropriate. I'm not like out in the streets. I'm not a Jewish Voice for Peace person. I'm not an anti-Zionist. I feel tremendous pain for what's going on now. And, just offer my prayers for peace. That's it.
Your prayers and your feet on the ground and your voice. I did see Combatants for Peace actually was running. I'm sure they've canceled it. I think in November was a trip to Israel. And I saw, you were mentioned as one of the people who wanted in.
That's right. We were like, yeah, that's right. January is going to go. I don't think it will go. We were planning to do a trip next October, 2024. God knows.
So, Sheila, as we come to the end of our conversation, I'm wondering, did you have an idea in your mind when you were younger of what success was? And if you did, how has that shifted?
Well, my mother had an idea of success. I was marrying, I always thought of as a dentist and living in a house in Long Island. I really didn't have an external idea of success. I wasn't like an ambitious child, or I don't think I've ever been ambitious, or that I've even longed for. To me, success is only about values. It's only about holding up what is wholesome, what is loving, what is just, and healing the places of brokenness. That's the only thing I can think of as any success that I would want to participate in.
Well, that's a big ask. And We lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, right? Like we do what we can. Just reading about, Norman Fisher saying there's sort of the contingent, if you will, compassion, right? Like we wake up and we do our practices to open ourselves to compassion, and those practices, like having meetings for combatants for peace, doing our part, are necessary, and they're only possible through being able to tap into the greater compassion, which, sometimes we can and sometimes we can. And if all we do is tap into the greater compassion, then nothing gets done and nothing changes on the ground. So they're both necessary.
Absolute and relative.
Yes, thank you. This has really been a pleasure, Sheila. Thank you so much for agreeing to be my guest and for sharing your story.
You're very welcome, and blessings to you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rabbi Sheila Peltz Weinberg. Some takeaways I'd like to share. Hold on to your dreams, even when they are delayed. Sheila described a deep knowing that she was meant to become a rabbi. However, as a single mom, she needed to work and took a job working for Hillel on a college campus instead. Though it took 6 years from the time she decided to become a rabbi until she actually enrolled in rabbinical school, she eventually did it while continuing her work with Hillel part-time. My second takeaway: recognize when you need help and actually reach out and get the help you need. Sheila had begun drinking to cope with the stress in her life. She recognized that her relationship with alcohol had gotten out of control. It had kept her together for a while until it stopped working. She started to go to AA meetings and found that an unexpected benefit was a completely renewed sense of spiritual life on a profound level. My last takeaway: be open to guidance from the universe. Sheila's friends from her women's circle told her about an opening for a rabbi in Amherst, Massachusetts. The head of the search committee of that synagogue pointed out to her that the Jewish community of Amherst is midway between two of the premier spiritual centers, Kripalu and Insight Meditation. To any other candidate, this information would have meant nothing. To Sheila, this information was fantastic and was the beginning of her journey to the next stage of her life, integrating Buddhism with Jewish practice. Are you enjoying this podcast? Please don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss next week's episode. And if you love the show, please leave a rating and a review, and it'll help other women like you to find it. And I would so greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Making Change with Your Money. Certified financial planner Laura Rotter specializes in helping people just like you organize, clarify, and invest their money in order to support a life of purpose and meaning. Go to www.TrueAbundanceAdvisors.com/workbook for a free resource to help you on your journey. Disclaimer: please remember that the information shared by this podcast does not constitute accounting, legal, tax, investment, or financial advice. It's for information purposes only. You should seek appropriate professional advice for your specific information.